Welcome everyone. Good afternoon. Welcome to the sixth event in our 2021-2022 NFUniversity term. As most of you will know, I'm Darren Qualman, National Farmers Union Director of Climate Crisis Policy and Action, and it's my pleasure to chair the event today. This is a bilingual event. If you'd like to listen in French, please go to the bottom of your Zoom screen and click on the globe icon that says interpretation to access French. Jillian?
Bonjour à tous et à toutes. Bienvenue à notre session de l'Université UNO. Si vous en avez besoin d'interprétation en français, veuillez aller au bas de l'écran et cliquer sur le globe, indiquez votre langue de choix. Nous espérons que vous aimerez la classe aujourd'hui.
Thank you. Next slide, please. NFUniversity is a series of twice-monthly Zoom webinars that delve deep into the issues to help us build our understanding and to increase our ability to advocate for the policy solutions we need. NFUniversity classes will be held on the second and fourth Thursdays of each month to the end of April. And to sign up for upcoming classes or watch for videos of past classes, please go to www.nfu.ca and click the button that says NFUniversity. And throughout this talk, when I mention a website, someone will post a link in the chat. Today, as part of our NFUniversity series, we're very pleased to welcome Dr. Rachel Smolker, a researcher and activist on the impacts of biofuels. She'll begin her talk in just a couple minutes. Just a note about using the chat function during today's presentation. Please keep that to a minimum, as side conversations can be distracting to speakers and to attendees. There will be 25 minutes after the presentation for oral questions and another 15 minutes for informal discussion and networking. That said, if you do see a technical issue, or if you need to contact me or the technical team during the presentation, please use the chat function for that purpose. I want to thank the staff and the volunteers who help make NFUniversity happen every 2 weeks. Today, Heather Beach, Gillian Cormier, Kathy Holslander, Camille Kuhn, and Mara Shaw are doing behind the scenes technical and support work. And thanks to our interpreter, Ronald Fournier, the NFU is pleased to offer this NFUniversity series in both official languages. If you want interpretation for upcoming sessions, please be sure to let us know when you register. And please do that at least a week before the upcoming session. Just a little bit about the National Farmers Union. The NFU is a grassroots member organization advocating for sustainable farms and a just food system. We have members in every Canadian province and most territories, producing a wide range of crops and livestock on farms, large and small, using diverse production systems. If you're not yet a member, we invite you to join. We urge you to join. If you farm, you can join as a voting member. Non-farmers are encouraged to become associate members. To join, go to www.nfu.ca/join. I would like to offer a land acknowledgement on behalf of the National Farmers Union. I'm in Territory 6 and the homeland of the Métis in what is called Saskatchewan. Treaty 6 includes the traditional territories of the Cree, Saulteaux, Nakota, and Dene peoples. We're being joined today in this webinar by people from across Canada, from the traditional homelands and unceded territories of many Indigenous peoples. Canada is a settler colonial country. The NFU understands that land acknowledgements are only a start. Therefore, the NFU is moving beyond acknowledgement to action. We invite you to join us in that work in whatever way you can. NFU Days, just want to say a little bit about that. Building our organization and welcoming new members is something our officials and staff focus on every day of the year. But for several weeks of each year, membership building is a special focus. NFU Days is our annual membership drive, and we've extended the membership price discount for NFU Days to the end of this month, to the end of February. All new memberships till the end of the month are 50% off. This is a great time to sign up a neighbor, so please think of someone in your community and invite them to join our organization. Here's a schedule for today's session. Our presenter will speak for 50 minutes. Then we will have 25 minutes for questions and answers from you. Following the Q&A period, we will keep the Zoom space open for about 15 minutes for informal discussion and networking for those who want to stay. The presentation today will be recorded and posted on the NFU's YouTube channel, though questions and answers will not be posted. Technicians, please ensure that the recordings are turned on. Now for today's session. Our presenter today is Dr. Rachel Smolker. Dr. Smolker is a co-director of Biofuelwatch, an information and campaigning organization focused on the negative impacts of large-scale industrial bioenergy, impacts on climate, biodiversity, and human rights. Her work ranges from grassroots community action to participation in UN conventions on climate and biodiversity. In recent years, her work is focused on bioenergy and climate and forest policy and providing critical perspectives on technologies for negative emissions, geoengineering, and biotechnology for bioenergy. Rachel Smolker has a PhD in biology and ecology from the University of Michigan. Prior to her current role, she worked as a field biologist and she lives in Vermont. Dr. Smolker, please go ahead with your presentation.
All right, can you see the first slide?
Yes, we can.
Great, thank you. Thank you so much for giving me the opportunity to address this audience. I'm very excited and honored to be able to do so, and also thank all the people in the audience out there who just show up as numbers in the participants block right at the moment. But I thank you for being here. So my presentation, Biofuels, a dirty, disastrous distraction, is kind of a review and some of the past lessons and stepping into the future. And much of this work, I want to acknowledge my co-workers at Biofuelwatch, and especially Alma Ernsting, who is a co-director who I've worked with for many, many years. And much of what I'm going to talk about, the insights would not have been possible without her. So thank you. I'm going to go through slides that have a lot of words on them. You needn't pay any attention to that because I'm going to talk the main messages to you on slides to have this information for later utility. So there are mandates and policies in over 65 countries around the world for biofuels, and many states in the United States have their own, and so on. Canada has its, the European Union has a renewable energy directive. We have our renewable fuel standard, California low carbon fuel standard. Brazil has a long history, and so on. And people have been for a long time asking some very basic questions. Do biofuels cause hunger? Do they really reduce greenhouse gas emissions? How do they impact land use decisions for farmers and other people? Do they come at the expense of biodiversity? Do they use more fertilizers, chemicals, and water? What is the role of biotechnology? Do they help us to reduce fossil fuel use and deliver energy independence? And what are the current trends and their implications? What should we do? There's been a long history of opposition to industrial scale bioenergy, which I've been involved in since the inception when the EU and the US were adopting their mandates. And we use the term agrofuels to differentiate from bio, which has the implications of life. So I wanted to just go through briefly. This is what's happened with the renewable fuel standard in the United States. The blue bar is what the mandate was set for in different years, the dark blue. The light blue is the portion of that that was met with corn. And down at the very, very bottom, you will see that cellulosic biofuel, which was supposed to be producing about half of the biofuel volume, total volume along the way, is basically non-existent. So corn has ended up being the by the vast measure, has been the winner in the renewable fuel standard. The impacts of this huge new demand for corn have kind of ricocheted around the world. And that became very clear right off the bat in 2008, when we saw a food crisis on the heels of the biofuel mandates in the US. And we see quotes here compiled from President of the World Bank, UN advisors, and including even the IMF and the World Bank, calling on G20 governments to scrap biofuel mandates and subsidies because of the impacts on food. And of course, corn and other commodities like soy are fundamental to so much of the food production that we depend on. And when an increase like the current 40% of the corn crop in the US is diverted into producing ethanol instead of food, and the land and water implications of that, it impacts throughout the food production and distribution system. When biofuels are diverted from food into feed, you can either expand the cropland into forests and grasslands, or you can increase the yields on existing croplands, or you can eat less. And for people living on the borderline financially, eating less is often falls upon their families. And so we saw rioting happening in the streets in 2008, and we've seen a steady impact on food prices from the diversion of food crops into biofuels. There are other factors that have gone into the food price issues, including higher fuel prices, demand for meat and dairy, growing population, and especially financial speculation on commodities. This is just a collection of some of the many reports that were put out on the impacts of biofuels on food. And I'll just skip through that. It was the organization GRAIN who first really started to dig in and look at the issue of land grabs and water grabs for biofuels, citing 293 cases involving some hundreds of, I can't see the number and I don't remember it off, but it's on the slide, hectares of land that were bought basically on speculation because of the hype around biofuels and how great they were going to be and how much we needed. And so speculators started buying up land, assuming that they would, get rich growing biofuel feedstocks. And this had impacts on people around the world, especially peasant farmers in places where land rights were not, solid and reliable. Right now, we've been working with some folks in Papua, for example, who are dealing with the Indonesian government's first occupation, but also their policies to install what they call food and energy estates, which are basically, cutting down the timber, which is very valuable, and then planting palm oil. Speculation on jatropha was rampant. That was one of the big examples. There were many, many land grabs and many struggles around the world that happened as a result of speculation on the great miracle of jatropha and all the biofuels that we would get from that. And actually, we don't have any biofuel from jatropha. And all of the harms that were done just based purely on speculation. This slide just shows you the land area footprint for different kinds of energy production. And at the very top, that very long purple bar up there is the very large land area footprint from soy. And the one below that is electricity from biomass, which is burning wood, essentially. Ethanol from cellulose below that. The point of this is just that compared to fossil fuels and some other forms of energy, the issue with biofuels is the huge amount of energy that is required to grow crops or harvest crops for their production. And the question is, whose land is it, where, and for what purpose? This is just the cover of a document that we did with some other groups way back in 2008, looking at the issue of marginal lands, because huge claims were being made about how much land was available around the world, excuse me, that could be used for growing bioenergy crops. And, you know, the Sokolov wedges, we can, if people remember that, it, you know, included a vast anticipated wedge of climate mitigation that would be met by biofuels. And those quote unquote marginal lands generally don't exist. They are lands that are in peasant farming, they're pastoralist lands, they're lands that are currently critical for biodiversity and so on. I'm going to make a little bit of a transition right at this point because I want to talk a little bit more now about some of the other lessons. We've learned a lot about the food impacts, biodiversity impacts, the issues of land grabs and human rights. I want to talk now about some of the lessons we've learned about false claims. The claims that are made around biofuels by the companies that are producing them are often really astonishing. And people sort of have a hard time realizing, I think, sometimes how outrageous they are. They are based on non-existent or long failed technologies, or they list incredible, you know, greenhouse gas emissions that they're going to deliver, or the capacity of the facility is really exaggerated beyond belief. Some of them have, you know, we're using nothing but fresh air and carbon, and I say fairy dust just to be a little bit funny, but honestly, like, you know, the claims are based on just absurd, really absurd rhetoric, turning CO2 from a liability into an asset, or reducing waste. Okay, what is waste? And then there's recently a lot of claims about being carbon negative, meaning capturing the carbon from the emissions and somehow burying it away from the atmosphere. So we went through a little bit about what happened with corn ethanol and the renewable fuel standard and the lack of cellulosic biofuels. So we've been for a long time told that the problems with corn ethanol and with food crop biofuels in general would go away soon because we would have these better biofuels that were made, would have lower greenhouse gas emissions. They would not be made from food crops. They'd be made from residues from agriculture or switchgrass or corn stubble, so on. And they wouldn't compete for food production in the same way that, say, corn ethanol has. And so that's been a story we've heard. Ethanol is like a bridge fuel to these better fuels. And we've been told that for many, many years now, that these better biofuels are coming soon. So we have dug in a little bit to looking at some of the technologies that are involved in those better biofuels. Cellulosic ethanol, excuse me, for example, producing biofuels from, say, wood or agriculture residues involves using genetically engineered microbes to access the sugars that are in woody material, which is composed of cellulose and hemicellulose and lignin. And those sugars are very hard to get to. And so we've seen a lot of the biotech industry focus on making genetically engineered microbes that are able to access those sugars, and then also others that can then ferment those sugars. And they're often a variety of different kinds of sugars. So fermenting them is not as easy as it is for, say, corn ethanol. That's one of the paths for making cellulosic ethanol. Another is using gasification, and which produces a synthetic gas, also called syngas, and then upgrading that into a fuel using a process called Fischer-Tropsch. And then a third is using pyrolysis, which makes pyrolysis oil and bio-oil, which then also has to be upgraded. And the question is, how technically possible are these technologies at commercial scale? We've seen that they basically haven't come to pass through what's happened with the renewable fuel standard. Almost no cellulosic ethanol has actually been produced. A few years ago, there was a huge amount of fanfare over the opening of a few facilities in the US. One was the POET DSM project, Liberty, they called it. Another was a facility by DuPont, and another one owned by Abengoa. And they were going to produce biofuels from agricultural residues. This is the title of a report that Biofuelwatch did on this topic of cellulosic biofuels. So Project Liberty was a huge amount of fanfare. The King of the Netherlands came there. You know, the Secretary of Agriculture was there. It was said that, you know, we couldn't do it, but we've done it. It's so much more than the sum of its parts. It's an historical moment in time. The shift of the fossil age marks the turning point of an important page in our history books. This facility opened in 2014 and then closed in 2019. It cost over $275 million. Much of that was public funds. The same was true for the DuPont facility and the Abengoa facility. They both opened and then closed after a few years. To date, we really don't have any cellulosic ethanol production, in spite of spending millions, billions actually, of dollars on technology development for these kinds of fuels. Gasification, Fischer-Tropsch, reforming, and pyrolysis techniques. These are technologies that we're seeing coming up again and again and again and again throughout history. And they involve very high temperature, high pressure process to break down the constituents of the biomass, and then, you know, create an oil or a gas and upgrade it. Companies like VELOSYS, Enerchem, which is there in Canada, Fulcrum BioEnergy, have made remarkable claims about how they are going to make biofuels using these gasification and pyrolysis technologies, using garbage or using wood, and basically none of them have succeeded. Doing gasification or pyrolysis is very tricky business. It creates a lot of tars. It's very hard to control the process. And many facilities have tried and failed at even at the pilot scale, much less scaling up to commercial scale. So it's funny when people come to us at Biofuelwatch with reports about, you know, a facility that's been proposed in their region that involves this technology. We generally say, don't worry about the land use implications and whether they're going to cut down the forest, because they'll probably never master the technology to do this. So they probably won't be making any fuel. It's just very unlikely that that's going to ever be successful. And yet we see these coming up over and over and over again. Fulcrum BioEnergy just a few days ago, making, you know, gasification process, I believe it is, to make biofuels from garbage. And of course, the waste problem is huge. Plastic waste and municipal solid waste. We're overwhelmed with it, and there's a strong desire to find ways to do something with it. And making energy from it is hugely appealing. Even our Environmental Protection Agency thinks that would be a good idea, but it doesn't work. This is a Red Rock Biofuels facility, and I brought this up because Red Rock Biofuels is just one example that we've followed for some years, and it's a particularly egregious example. The site is in Lakeview, Oregon, and they were talking about making biofuels from wood harvested from the surrounding 125-mile radius or so. It's very isolated. They needed rail transport for their transport of their fuel, which people were concerned about. Also, air emissions was fought. It's been fought for 25 years. This facility has been in the makes for 25 years, and some $350 million at least funding through the Department of Defense for the Defense Procurement Act. And their technology would be provided by this company, VELOSYS, which has already been tested and tried in several different places and failed over and over again. And yet subsidies and supports and policies continue to flow into this 25-year-old failed project that is going to use a technology, VELOSYS technology, that has already been proven failed on multiple occasions, and companies that have gone bankrupt trying to use it. So This is a cover of another report we did. A lot of hype around the idea that we can make biofuels from algae. The problem with that is that there is no commercial production of algae biofuels in spite of billions of dollars investment and I don't know, 50, 60, 80 years of trying to do that. There are some very fundamental barriers to doing that, having to do with photosynthesis, which, the biotech industry is very much involved with engineering microalgae to be more suitable to the conditions that would make it possible to develop algae biofuels, which is disturbing because the characteristics that they're engineering are, high productivity, resistance to harsh conditions, and other characteristics that make it very concerning that should these engineered microalgae be released into the environment, they could have a competitive advantage over some of the algae that already exist in nature. And because algae blooms are so problematic, there's a lot of risk involved with that. And there's no biofuels being produced. Most of the companies that have tried have ended up instead producing niche products like anti-wrinkle cream. This is Solazyme, millions in public subsidies, ended up making anti-wrinkle face cream and some kind of a drilling lubricant for fracking, I believe. So there's, overall a shocking mismanagement of public funds by irresponsible agencies, the US Department of Agriculture, DOE, and Department of Defense. And I suspect Canada has its own version of this irresponsibility in putting huge amounts of money into research and development of technologies that have had their chance to be proven and still don't work. So a couple of examples. Range Fuel was going to make biofuels from wood using, I believe it was pyrolysis technique. Kior, the largest fraud ever perpetrated on the state of Mississippi, again, was going to make some kind of either pyrolysis or gasification process using wood and failed and went bankrupt. Mascoma is a really interesting case. They were led by an academic from Dartmouth College near me, who was supposedly making a massive breakthrough in using synthetic biology technologies to create something called integrated biorefining, which would allow both accessing the sugars and refining them all in the step, which would have greatly improved the efficiency of cellulosic ethanol. I can't remember how much funding went into the Mascoma project. They did one pilot project and then they went around and proposed many other refineries, some, I don't know, $200–300 million in public funding, and from states and also from the state of Canada because they went there too. And they never even built a refinery. They didn't even lay one brick for a refinery and never made any fuels. The college did benefit tremendously from the funding that went into the synthetic biology department though. So I wanted to touch briefly on the issue of bioenergy with carbon capture and sequestration, because we are seeing more and more biofuel startups talking about, Iogen's not a startup, but they've been around for a while, but biofuel companies that are talking about being carbon negative, and they're going to, bury the emissions from the production of their fuels in underground, and their fuel processing will become carbon negative. Some of them will go so far as to say that, as this one does, they will achieve net zero, making fuels that reduce CO2 in the atmosphere with every drop used. So that's a common outrageous claim to encourage us to drive more using their carbon negative fuels. Iogen is just one example. Bioenergy with carbon capture and sequestration is a complete non-existent technology. There's no question that, that bioenergy and carbon capture and sequestration can help to contain global warming. There's no more empirical evidence that it can contain global warming than there is evidence for the existence of carbon sucking extraterrestrials. This is, it's a sad fact that even, for example, the International Panel on, for Climate Change has gone through a lot of back and forth with their mitigation subgroup on the role of bioenergy with carbon capture and sequestration. We've seen CCS under the guise of clean coal for some 50 years or so now, having failed. You have some facilities, Boundary Dam up there in Canada, which have barely succeeded to capture and sequester carbon that they're capturing from their process. Doing that with bioenergy would be even much more difficult than it is with coal because of the complex mix of the flue gases, which would mean you would need even more bioenergy because the energy penalty for doing carbon capture itself adds somewhere around 30% of an energy penalty to the facility. So about 30% more energy is required. So BECCS is a non-starter, which doesn't stop the rhetoric, unfortunately. So I want to talk a bit about some of the real fuels, the real technologies, and the real problems now that I've impressed upon you about all the false claims, current and future trends. So one of the things that's currently happening is the aviation industry's push for, quote, sustainable aviation fuel. And I noticed that Canada has its own Sky's the Limit challenge, and our President Biden has recently put forward a call for aviation biofuels. And CORSIA is the International Civil Aviation Organization, which put forward, in the first place, a plan, CORSIA, Carbon Offset Reduction Scheme for International Aviation, CORSIA, which would require the aviation industry to reduce emissions from aviation by a significant amount. And short of finding electric planes to work or really improving the functioning of planes, the only way to do that, in their view, is through sustainable aviation fuels. So the biofuel industry is now responding with great enthusiasm and optimism towards satisfying what would be an astronomical demand for, quote, sustainable aviation fuels. The only feasible way that we have right now for producing aviation grade biofuels, and they have to have specific characteristics that work in airplanes, it's not the same as cars, is what's called HEFA or HVO, hydrotreated vegetable oils. And there was a report that was just put out by Serology, Chris Malins and his partner, Animal, Vegetable, or Mineral Oil, which I would refer you to read up more about the sudden surge in enthusiasm for hydrotreated vegetable oils, or HVO. The Energy Information Administration says that if all of the announced plans, this is just in the US, by the way, come to fruition, renewable diesel production would increase fivefold by 2024 from just under 2 billion to over 5 billion gallons a year. Running all of those facilities at full capacity would create 17 million metric tons additional demand for oils and fats. That's a lot. And that's actually so much that it's considered unlikely that all of those claims will come to pass. But major players are jumping on board with HVO, and Neste is probably the world leader in this particular technology, and they have facilities in Singapore, which is central to the Indonesian Malaysian region where palm oil is mostly grown. Neste is known to be sourcing some of the palm oil that they use from mills that have been linked to deforestation, including mills that are that have leveled and sourced and planted palm oil inside of national park regions and so on. The whole issue of palm oil is devastating to the whole region in Indonesia and Malaysia. I want to highlight also that CPO refers to crude palm oil, but PFAD, palm fatty acid distillate is a product from palm oil as well. And the palm oil industry likes to refer to it as a waste product, but it is not. It's used for lots of different purposes, just as crude palm oil is. And an increased demand in PFAD would increase demand for palm oil. Shell has jumped on board with plans for major facilities for HVO biofuels in Singapore and another facility in Rotterdam. And Marathon and Phillips 66 are two familiar cases in my neck of the woods in California. Well, I'm in Vermont, but my colleague Gary Hughes is in California, has been informing me about what's going on there, where oil refineries are, from Marathon and Phillips, are converting their processes to make hydrotreated vegetable oils. And they're doing that in part because converting oil refineries to make hydrotreated vegetable oils has some advantages. One of them is that there's already facilities for producing large amounts of hydrogen, which is necessary. Canada also has big plans for renewable diesel, is another term that's often bandied around for HVO, talking about going from zero production currently to 81 to 327 million liters in the space of a few years. So just going back to the California case, this is a figure from a report done by Greg Karras, and the point of this figure for you, not to try to figure out what it means, but the point of this is that the production of renewable diesel in California, which is that little orange wedge down at the very bottom, and then which also has biodiesel, has actually been part of what has increased the overall petroleum distillate. So the more California has been producing biodiesel and renewable diesel, the more they have been exporting petroleum-based diesel. So it's not replacing, it's adding to. That's why the report was called Throwing Biofuel on Fire. So people often ask this question, do biofuels reduce emissions? And in a nutshell, the answer is no, not when proper accounting is done. And this is just a pictorial example that I pulled off the internet of a life cycle analysis that somebody did. And many people have done many different life cycle analyses on different fuel pathways, from corn ethanol to hydrotreated vegetable oil to biodiesel from rapeseed or canola, and so on. So the question is, what is included in those life cycle analyses? It depends on what and how you does the kind, because people have different interests in their fuels as being great for the climate or not so great. And I want to read through this. This is from a very important study that was published in 2020. It was a major review of life cycle analysis studies. You can go into the literature and find individual studies, life cycles of every different flavor. They're all over the place, but this was useful because it was a review. And what it concluded is that the outcomes of life cycle studies are highly situational and dependent on many factors, including the type of feedstock, the production routes, data variation, methodological choices. Despite this, the existing evidence suggests that land use change if land use change is involved, first generation biofuels can on average have lower greenhouse gas emissions than fossil fuels. But the reductions are mostly insufficient to meet the savings required by the EU Renewable Energy Directive. I want to highlight, they say, as long as land use change, where no land use change is involved. If no land use change is involved, they sort of do, but they don't really meet the EU Renewable Energy Directive requirements. However, second generation biofuels have in general the potential to reduce the emissions provided there is no land use change. So this was their conclusion. As long as you ignore land use change, the greenhouse gas savings from these many studies that they reviewed don't really quite meet it. And they also point out that these reductions are achieved at the expense of other impacts, including acidification from water use, eutrophication, and biodiversity loss. Okay, so reducing greenhouse gas emissions, not even really meeting the requirements of the EU Renewable Energy Directive at the expense of many other important aspects of life on Earth. And the thing that shocked me when I read that is that they had omitted land use change, which for years now has been this highly debated aspect of biofuel greenhouse gas impact. This figure is from a study that was commissioned by the European Commission to look at indirect land use change impacts. And they did modeling. You can ignore everything from on the right-hand side, but over towards the left, the very, very tall bar that you see there, that is the anticipated greenhouse gas emissions from palm oil derived biofuels. The second tallest bar there is soy, and the third is rapeseed oil and sunflower oil on either side of palm oil. So very high indirect land use changes associated with these different fuels. So what is indirect land use change? There's direct and indirect land use. The direct changes happen when you plow up a field and plant a field that maybe wasn't in agriculture before, and you plant a crop of corn or something else. That's direct. The indirect impacts are things that happen when the use that was in place can no longer be met. So if biofuels if vegetable oils are being diverted into use for biofuels, people who are using vegetable oils for other purposes, be it cooking or whatever, have to go someplace else and find their vegetable oil from some other source. And so that's an indirect land use change impact. And indirect land use change is massive when you're talking about such huge areas, land areas, and such huge quantities of products from the land. What's troubling is specifically with vegetable oil markets is that these markets are all connected. So indirect land use change ricochets through all of the vegetable oil markets. This figure on the left shows you the really astounding growth in vegetable oil production worldwide. And the blue on the top is palm oil and palm kernel oil. The green just below that is soybean oil. And below that, we have various other kinds of oil, including rapeseed, maize, sunflower, sesame, and so on. Very, very rapid, very expansive growth in vegetable oil production has happened in the past 20 years, 30 years, 50 years. And what we see on the figure on the right is that vegetable oil prices for all these different kinds of oil, sunflower, rapeseed, soybean, palm oil, they all go up and down in concert with one another because of this fact that they are linked in their demand. So when there's less soybean oil available for some purpose, people go to buy palm oil. Palm oil tends to be the least expensive vegetable oil available. And so in general, indirect land use or indirect demand, when demand is diverted into biofuel production or other uses, it's palm oil that ends up ultimately, the impact lands on an expanded demand for palm oil because it's cheap. More demand for canola or rapeseed and soy drives palm oil expansion, just as I said. Increases in the price of soybean oil in the US drives imports of palm oil into the US, and similarly increases in rapeseed oil price in Europe lead to increased palm oil imports to the region, even if they're for different reasons. This is just a figure showing some about the expansion of soya. Like palm oil, soya expansion has escalated dramatically in recent years. It's a primary vegetable oil used for the hydrotreated vegetable oils and biodiesel, especially here in the US. Some 95 million hectare increase since 1970, equivalent to all of the arable land in Brazil and Argentina combined. I've been down into Central America. I'm guessing some other folks here have Central and South America seen what the expansion of soya has done to the landscape there, and it is really disturbing. Estimates are that some 40% of tropical deforestation is the result of the expansion of both soya and palm oil.
Rachel, 10 minutes left.
Okay, thank you. Palm oil expansion, a social and ecological disaster. I won't go into this, but we've all heard about the demise of the orangutans, which really troubles me. I spent some time working in a previous life in a rehabilitation center in Borneo for the orangutans, and this is what got me back into working on biofuels. The forest fires from burning peatlands, which are not only a huge source of pollution, but also greenhouse gas emissions. How about using waste? Well, waste oils are generally already in use, and so we have the same indirect, diversion of one oil, vegetable oil leads to, and ultimately more palm oil. There are very limited supplies of used cooking oil, for example, available. There's also been a number of cases of fraud where used cooking oil has been, oils have been claimed to be used cooking oil, but tracing found that they were not. There's a lot of incentive for using, used cooking oil as opposed to crude palm oil, for example. Forestry waste, how is that defined? What other uses already exist? And what about municipal solid waste? So I'm going to gloss over this, but there are a lot of problems with the issues around waste, either in the processing or in the definition of what is waste and what the impacts are when those wastes, which are already in use, get diverted. Can biofuels provide us with energy security? Project Liberty, right? And this was a big part of the, energy independence and security, right? Clearly not. This is primary energy consumption by energy source for the year 2020. This is for the United States. The figures are even more alarming, actually, if you look globally, but I couldn't pull up the figure quickly. And interesting, renewable energy is all the way up to about 12% of our primary energy consumption, but that's not very much. And to ramp up biofuel production, to fill in all the rest of the natural gas, petroleum, nuclear power, and coal is pretty unrealistic. Can it provide some increment towards energy security? Well, maybe. I would like to point out that out of the 12% of renewable energy there, almost half of it is biofuels and biomass, and electric wind. That did not stop the US military from making a lot of fanfare about their, I can't remember what it was called, the Great Green Affair, whatever, where they ran some military exercises using biofuels. Biofuels are basically wasting precious time and money. Global subsidies in 2010 were estimated some 22 billion, rising to 67 billion per year cumulative. Projected accumulation of 1.4 trillion in subsidies from 2011 to 2035. Imagine what we could have done with that money and what we should do with it in the future. And for all of that, they are providing about 3% of our transportation fuels. That's it. I want to highlight the role of biotechnology in biofuel production. And the biotechnology industry is, the biotechnology industry is central in many of the technologies, as I mentioned, for microalgae biofuels and also for cellulosic ethanol production, growing genetically engineered crops, soya, increased use of even some of the most familiar GE crops like soya and corn, but also developing engineered crops that are specifically designed to be refined into fuels. Algae and yeast, genetically engineered microbes of many different sorts, and also genetically engineering trees to grow faster and produce more biomass or to be more amenable to breaking down the cellulose for biofuel production. And so these new technologies are providing that, you know, you were informed about through Ricarda's presentation a couple of weeks ago. These are only advancing and speeding up these developments with less and less regulatory or sufficient regulatory oversight. What I've talked about today has mostly been about liquid biofuels, but I want to be sure that you understand that this is only a very small part of the big picture, that all of that land area we're talking about, for vegetable oil, biofuels, and corn ethanol, and so on, is only a small part of the bigger picture of a bioeconomy, it's sometimes referred to, in which we would be generating electricity from burning mostly wood. We would be making biofuels for our cars, and we would be making plastics out of biomass and bioproducts of all sorts from, you know, we already make a lot of fabrics from corn and from other, starchy crops, but there is a massive amount of research going into this, you know, turning the bio into stuff. And it will take several planets, and it's simply not realistic to think that we can just convert from burning the fossil to burning the living biosphere and fuel the consumption patterns that that we've become accustomed to. So I can't quite read this because there's some things blocking this, but I wanted to I often think about the very thin layer of our biosphere, which is very beautiful and very delicate and very thin film that surrounds our planet and is our life support system. And there's only so much that we can take from that and make into stuff without undermining the life support systems that are essential to our future. And I'm afraid that the push for biofuels is one of the worst threats actually that we are facing in terms of the impacts on this delicate biosphere. And ironically, it's being presented as a solution to climate change. You know, we've been for years faced with, you know, being in this awkward position of opposing solutions to climate change, but not all solutions are real solutions. Some solutions are false solutions, and biofuels are definitely a false solution. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Dr. Smolker, for the excellent presentation. Thank you. That was fantastic.